Do you like Friday the 13th Part 1 and 2? Would you like to see those movies again but with a different number at the end and really cheesy 3D? Then boy do I have a film for you! Friday the 13th Part 3 is in many ways the prototypical Friday the 13th movie. Stop me if this sounds familiar. A group of older teens go to a cabin in the woods in the middle of nowhere to smoke pot, have sex and drink, and then a masked madman comes and picks them off one by one, until only a single girl survives. I'd describe more of the plot, but that's really pretty much it this time round. The formula is stuck to as rigidly as possible. The only deviance from it is that Chris, our final girl this time round, has a past trauma surrounding Jason having been kidnapped by him when she was younger and not remembering what followed or how she got back home in her bed. And also I guess there's technically an antagonistic force besides Jason in that our teenage cast find themselves getting into a bit of trouble with a local biker gang, but their screen time is small and ultimately they just end up being more numbers for the body count. Other than these little details, it is as quintessentially Friday the 13th as any Friday the 13th movie could be. This movie is the movie that people think Friday the 13th 1 is. Hell, I'll go one further and say that this movie feels like if you got an AI to write Friday the 13th movies based on nothing more than someone who hasn't seen any of the film's description of the franchise, right down to the hockey mask. Yes, that's right, he's finally here. 2 whole movies down with not a hockey mask in sight, and then for some reason it's the gimmicky third movie that less people know about that made the man an icon and gave him the most signature detail of his look and his one defining feature that would appear in every successive entry. This is the movie that introduces him.
Here comes the boy. Hello, boy. Welcome. There he is here.
Besides marking the first appearance of Jason wearing a hockey mask though, it doesn't really do anything revolutionary to change things up. This is Friday the 13th by the numbers and brings with it all the good and bad that statement carries. Its only real defining interesting feature that makes it in any way stand out within its franchise, besides Jason's new fashion choices, is that this was the 80s after 3D spaghetti western Coming At Ya had released and temporarily brought back the 3D craze of the 1950s. So suddenly, big popcorn movies, especially horrors and especially third films in horror franchises, had to be released in that novelty new 80s style 3D, which for this particular film means finding literally any excuse to point things right into the camera at every second. They go so hilariously overboard with this shtick, I'd say it could be a drinking game, but if you had to take a shot every time someone obnoxiously brought something super close to the foreground, you would probably die of alcohol poisoning. They milk this gimmick for all it's worth. So many of the times that the film chucks things at the camera are so clearly forced and unnatural, and they don't even try to hide what they're doing. Like at one point, our teenagers drive through a neighborhood and we stop to gratuitously awe a nearby child's baseball bat sticking out of the screen. What does that have to do with anything? I don't know, but it might make an audience go, ooh, through their glasses, so you best believe we gotta put it in there. It's so blatant and bold, I can't help but respect the complete lack of subtlety. In many ways, this is kind of the perfect little microcosm of the franchise. It's something that's kind of earnest, but also kind of goofy. It's escapist popcorn spectacle nonsense, and it ain't subtle about it. Now I should stress that when I call the film by the numbers, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Yes, it repeats a lot of what made the first 2 resonate with audiences, right down to a straight up scene for scene recreation of some of the kills, as well as the iconic final jump scare of the first film, here done to significantly less scary effect because 1, we've already seen this, 2, it was better before when we weren't expecting it, and 3, it's just not as well directed this time around. But ripping off its own franchise aside, it does kind of fine tune and in some ways perfect the formula that would lay the template for a lot of the future entries, as well as really embrace some of the things fans would latch onto as the legacy of the films grew. If Friday the 13th Part 2 marked a transitional phase for the films, one that introduced its primary killer and a greater leaning towards more gory practical effects and over-the-top deaths, then Part 3 is the one that refined those elements into the mainstays of the series they would become. The Jason of 2 isn't the indestructible hulking monster you'd come to expect of the series, but rather plays out more a fairly big and strong looking, but otherwise unremarkable and normal human being. He's kind of clumsy, he falls over, he can be tackled and fought one-on-one in a manner that doesn't see his potential victim grossly out of their league when it comes to strength. It's not that he's not dangerous or formidable, it's just that he's just a guy with some sharp tools and a mean streak. The Jason of Part 3, however, has a bit more of the unsettling creepy nature he'd become famous for. There's a lot more menacing standing around, staring and skulking in the shadows this time. It all feels just a bit more methodical. He's just got this way bigger presence. Where Part 2 Jason would use a tool to get into a locked car, Part 3 Jason will just put his head through the window without flinching. He's a way more intimidating figure here, far more in line with the icon he'd become known to be. And as far as cinematic choices go, these decisions make the villain feel a lot more threatening than his sack-wearing brethren. Also, this is where the series really starts to embrace some of the sillier and more creative aspects of its trademark violence, and as a result, it feels somewhat less nihilistic and cynical as a whole. A big criticism this series gets is how voyeuristic it feels in nature, and while it is true that most of its thrills still come from the unbridled torment of innocent teens, that voyeurism hits a little different when instead of a character, say, having their throat slit, they instead get their head squeezed so hard a prosthetic eyeball pops out and flies over the audience in goofy 3D. It doesn't feel quite so grimy and dirty this time round. It's a bit lighter, a bit more daft, a bit more fun, a bit more Looney Tunes. While I wouldn't say it's a better movie than the first two films in that it has both the least interesting cast and plot, given the choice between any of the first three to put on at a party with friends, there's no question that the third film would likely be my top pick there. One thing I will say that I don't like though, and maybe this is like a controversial hot take, I'm not sure, I'm not really up to date on what the general consensus is within the Friday the 13th fandom, but I am not the biggest fan of this Jason performance. It's kind of a medal of honor within horror to get to play Jason Voorhees now, but I suppose at the time of this film's release, maybe it didn't have as much prestige surrounding it, this being only the third actor to portray him, not including the 3 seconds of child Jason Ari Lemon got from popping out of a lake in Part 1's ending dream sequence. Perhaps then, this is why Richard Brooker here didn't put in any real amount of gravitas into his performance. Perhaps he's actually doing an excellent job based on how the director wanted him to play the part. I've got nothing against the guy personally, but just in this performance here, to me, he just looks bored. There is something to be said for the on-paper idea of terror that comes from a killer almost wholly disengaged from his acts of violence. You see it with Michael Myers in Halloween. There's a distance there between him and his victims. He approaches his killing with this kind of cold, clinical objectivity devoid of any emotion. And that's conceptually horrifying. The idea that such a monstrous person could be so evil and unempathetic that his murders don't even seem to register in his brain as anything worth having a feeling for. A man who treats murder as something so trivial, he emotively reacts to it the same way you or I might react to brushing our teeth. That blank emotionless stare can communicate something far more harrowing than a giddy joy at the sight of a victim's blood ever could. I can only guess that this is maybe what they were trying to go for with Jason here. But it doesn't feel so much like Jason is emotionally detached from his victims to me, so much as it does that he's just having a bad time. He approaches killing the same way I approached washing dishes at Subway back when I had a shitty part-time job there as a young student. Everything he does just feels lazy and lethargic. There's a moment that really epitomizes this for me where he shoots a lass through the eye with a harpoon, and I honestly cackle every time it happens, because immediately afterwards he just unceremoniously drops it down in what looks like an almost comical sulk, like his mam's just told him to stop playing with his friends and called him in to do his homework. It's hilarious, but very unintentionally so. I will say that despite this laid back performance, out of all the films so far, this one makes it the easiest to root for our melancholy maniac in that it gives us the most miserable, unlikable dickheads of a cast out of all of the Friday films so far. The first movie's teenagers were mostly nondescript. They kinda didn't really have characters. I guess Ned was a bit of an obnoxious prankster, but for the most part they were all just inoffensively indistinct from one another. The second film gave us some actually likeable people. The final girl Ginny had a good deal of personality about her, and the rest of the cast were believably teenage and for the most part perfectly pleasant. Part 3 though, fucking hell. Besides final girl Chris and side character Vera, everybody else in this movie is just insufferable. It doesn't help as well that we're reminded of the far better second film's cast before the events of this film start, since this movie's first 5 minutes are just 5 unedited minutes from the end of that previous film. Yeah, these movies are made real cheap. You'll note that this is the second time they've done this. But seriously, my God, these characters. The biker gang are obnoxious. They've got that kind of overtly confrontational personality that just does not exist in reality. No one acts like this outside of school bullies in Karate Kid films. Shelley, this film's prankster role, is a self-pitying, woe-is-me, bell-end incel and a massive misogynist who calls Vera a bitch even though she's perfectly nice to him just because she doesn't want to go out with him. And worst of all, Rick, our main character's boyfriend, is a gross pest who constantly bitches and whines that his clearly traumatized girlfriend won't bang him. Like seriously, it feels like every single line to come out of his mouth is just him complaining to his girlfriend that she hasn't slept with him yet. This one's cast also has probably the most consistent bad acting of the film so far, which is saying something. Apparently the whole focus behind the scenes was just on making the 3D effects work. Like performances absolutely came second fiddle. According to the actors, the filmmakers just did not give a shit how lines were read. Now that I think about it, maybe that extends to Jason's performance too, and it could be why he has such a languid demeanour. On the subject of the performances, Tracy Savage, who played Debbie, one of the film's teenage victims, said, "The key priority in every scene was making sure that the 3D effects worked. It didn't matter how the lines were delivered, it didn't matter if we stumbled or fumbled, it didn't matter if our performance was not perfect. We never did a second take." But honestly, the janky performances only adds to its charm. It just makes this movie even more the epitome of Friday the 13th than it already was. It's a great little dumb scary movie night flick, best enjoyed with pals and pizza. I probably like this movie more than most just because I have a lot of warm nostalgia for it. The first time I watched this movie was actually in what I would consider to be the perfect setting for its viewing. At a packed cult movie night around 2 or 3 in the morning, watching a 3D version of the film through cheesy old red and cyan glasses, complete with audience members giggling at the very obnoxious and barely functional illusions of dumb stuff flying at the screen. It was great. All in all though, personal nostalgia aside, I think I really just summed up this whole film at the beginning of this vid. It's as Friday the 13th as they come, in all of the negative and positive ways. It's like the yin and yang of Friday the 13th movies. You get the series' most unlikable teenagers so far, but you get the most fun kills so far. You get the least interesting plot, but the most fun gimmick. You get a more bored looking Jason performance, but you get the better Jason character. It's a movie of give and takes. It's Friday the 13th with warts and all. And for a lot of people, myself included, it's all it needs to be. A dude in a hockey mask killing teens in a cheap, goofy, gory 80s movie. Nothing more, nothing less. Anyway, that's another Friday flick in the bag. As always, be sure to like and comment with your thoughts, subscribe to my Only Dance at the red button below, and if you're feeling really supportive, check me out on Patreon for a bunch of perks. More info at the link in the description. And with that, I've been Dan Drambles, you're watching Wholesome Halloween 2 / a season, and I will see you again tomorrow.